Right. Thank you everyone for joining us for our Food for Thought speaker session. We've been going for almost a year, so we're glad to see all of you here. Today, we're honored to have Rachel Cummings, who's going to be discussing um, how should we explain privacy guarantees to users, an investigation into user expectations for differential privacy. If you have any questions, we'll leave those to the end where we have our Q&A session. You can keep yourself on mute unless you're asking a question. And if you can raise your hand or put your question in the chat, that'd be great. And I'll hand it off to Bill so you can do the introduction.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thank you to Jeremy and Valerie for keeping this series alive for quite some time, and we've got multiple speakers out in the future. So we'll be going through this summer and hopefully into next fall and next year and on and on and on. So we're very honored to have Professor Cummings with us today. She has a topic that is of great interest and of great cogency at this time, after we're all spending so much of our time sharing our lives and our rooms and our voices and our recordings with everyone in the world, and God knows what the consequences of it will be in the long run, but it was necessary and we've done it. And she's a person who is really expert on almost every level of this whole issue of what happens with our voices and faces and recordings and whatever, and how much of it we're giving approval to and how much we don't even know. So Dr. Cummings has a PhD in computing and mathematical sciences from California Institute of Technology. She has a master's degree in computer science from Northwestern and a bachelor's degree in mathematics from USC. She's an assistant professor at the Stewart School of Industrial and Systems Engineering at Georgia Tech, which I think you all know is, one of the most well-known centers of this whole area. Her research has been focused on data privacy, machine learning, algorithmic economics, optimization, statistics, and information theory, really the center of a lot of what's going on in academia and economics and the economy worldwide. She's won numerous fellowships and awards from Google, from the Simmons Berkeley Research. Her dissertation received honorable mention. She won a doctoral prize. She's part of the Caltech Leadership Award Group. Really a very, very distinguished person with a very strong academic background and very interesting public policy interests. So Rachel, thank you so much for being with us. As Jeremy said, we'll hold our questions, although the chat is always open to put questions there. Jeremy will monitor that for us. And we will, as we always have, we'll stop promptly at 1 o'clock. So Rachel?
Well, thank you for that fantastic and warm introduction. I have some slides. Let me share them. And I feel like no matter how many graduate degrees in a computer science one has, sharing screens on Zoom is always the most a terrifying experience. Everyone can see?
Yes. I'm going to mute myself now, Rachel, so please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I feel like a few kind of words of background. First of all, I was at Georgia Tech until a December, and I have very recently moved here. And so I'm actually now Columbia faculty as of January. And so I'm very happy to be here and kind of meeting others at the same institution, and in large part this work is basically talking about the gaps between technical tools and policy implementation. And so I hope this will spark some like, conversations. Hopefully they can be like ongoing with this group in terms of like, how do we do privacy policy? Because I think we can all agree, let's just say many open research questions there. So my background, I work on like, computer science algorithm design, and this is joint work with a cryptographer, Gabe, and a kind of like survey design expert, Alyssa. And so I feel like this is almost like, I feel like this is almost a kind of like, opening line of a joke. Hey, like, algorithm designer, cryptographer, and a like survey methodologist walk into a bar, and what happens is this paper. So my work has focused primarily on this notion of like a differential privacy. If you haven't heard of it, that's okay, because the whole talk is going to be about how do we explain this kind of like complicated mathematical object to people who are not engineers and are not mathematicians. And so this is a kind of like a behavioral study measuring how do people respond to various like descriptions of this privacy guarantee, hence our title. And in fact, this was actually a quote, and we asked people, how do you feel about like differential privacy? And one person told us back, I need a better description. And that was like a perfect title for the work. So I'll start by kind of talking about where does like a differential privacy fit into our current like privacy policies and privacy rules, and then I'll go into like technically what is this privacy notion, and then I'll talk about our experiment. And so let's say there's like a company, and like it's a good company, and they're trying to like do the right thing and care about privacy, and so they tell users, you should buy my product, it is good, it's cool. And the user will say like, great, that sounds fantastic, I like cool products, but also like I care about privacy, tell me about your privacy policies. And the company might say like, oh, it's fine, don't worry, we are good, and we're not gonna like do bad things with your data. But the user, if they truly are smart and savvy, they might say like, no, actually, I'm not okay to just kind of like, take it on faith. I want to know how specifically are you going to like protect my privacy. And the way the computer scientists imagine this conversation going is this company says like, oh, it's okay, I use like differential privacy, it's fine. But the reality is a user will then say, what is that? And so this is not a satisfactory conversation if this is how these kind of like consumers feel at the end. And so we're going to figure out today, how can we change this part of the conversation? And I'm going to start on the next like 2 slides. It's kind of like, how do we explain this to like computer scientists, engineers, and you will very quickly see we should not explain it in this way to users. And so if you don't like math, I apologize for the next 2 slides, but there'll only be 2 slides of math. So basically, here is the like here's a kind of formal definition of like a differential privacy in pictures, and this was defined back in like 2006 by like Dwork, McSherry, Nissim, and Smith. And it says, imagine if I were to plug a database into some algorithm, and so this database is going to contain one kind of entry for each person, and I'm going to plug this into my favorite randomized algorithm, and that algorithm is going to produce a distribution over outputs. And so this curve is basically showing us a distribution over outputs that may be produced by this algorithm if I plug in this particular database. And so this is saying I might output this thing with this probability. And so now we're going to imagine if I were to change one person's data, say that I change Chris into Javier, and I now plug a new database that is like the same except for one person's data into my same algorithm, I'm now going to get out a different distribution over outputs because I have provided different inputs, and that may be this like red curve. And the privacy guarantee, it says like a point-wise, I want this ratio to be bounded. And so now, like, intuitively, what this gives us is we're saying, like, imagine that I like observe this blue line as my output, and I try to figure out that I observe this output because it was sampled from the blue curve or from the red curve. I wouldn't know because those things are kind of like, about the same probability events under these two different neighboring databases that are the same except for one person. And so this is like in pictures. In math, it says this. And so some algorithm M, the maps from kind of like n tuples of inputs. And so think of this as being like, n people's data into some kind of arbitrary output range is going to be parameterized epsilon differentially private. If it is a case that like for all neighboring databases, meaning like they are the same except for one person's data, and for all possible things I may produce as a result of this analysis, I'm going to produce that thing with about the same probability under these two neighboring databases. And it's kind of like approximately the same is going to be parameterized by this term epsilon. And effectively, we are bounding the ratio between these two terms with this probability epsilon. And so now kind of interpreting it, what is this privacy guarantee actually giving us? So it's like effectively bounding the kind of like maximum amount one person's data can change the result of a computation. And so now imagine these two neighboring databases are kind of like different under only your data. And so maybe you like, share data or you don't, or you might like, be truthful on a survey, or you might lie. And we're saying anything that may happen, it's going to happen with kind of like about the same probability, whether or not I see your data. And so you can think of this as some like, collection of bad outcomes that may happen as a result of the analysis. Maybe it's your like, health insurance prices rising. Maybe it's like, stalkers coming to your house. And we're saying if this was going to happen like because of your data, the same thing would have happened even if I hadn't seen your data. And so this kind of addresses the paradox of learning nothing about the individual, but still learning things about the population, right? And so it's like saying, I can learn there's a causal link between smoking and lung cancer, but I can't learn whether like, you personally smoke or you personally have cancer. And it's important to also note, this is a definition, and it is not like an algorithm. I'm not saying, here is what you do to your data, but I'm simply asking, does what you do to your data satisfy this very specific like condition? And so like, depending on how you feel about math, those two slides might have been like, PTSD to like, high school or college, or it might have been fine. But the reality is these tools actually do have like very, very strong privacy guarantees. And we now have a kind of very nice algorithmic toolkit of code for kind of doing data analysis tasks subject to this privacy constraint. And these tools are being deployed. And the question is like, how should these organizations explain differential privacy to their users? Because they definitely should not have the last two slides on their billboards. Before I go on to kind of talk about this like an explanation question, are there any questions about like the privacy guarantee in general, what it does or doesn't provide?
Just one quick question. So based on your experience, is what was illustrated on the two slides widespread in the industries that consumers touch? Is this a typical and what I understand to be very secure way of protecting individual information?
Yeah, yeah. And it is like a very secure, and it provides like a very strong worst case privacy guarantees. And these have begun to be deployed in a more widespread way in the last, I'll say, like 3 years or so. I think before that, they were deployed, I think, like, Microsoft and Google started like deploying them quite a while ago, but it was kind of like quietly and on only very small, like, portions of their data analysis. And we're seeing now at these companies, as well as at like smaller ones, this is becoming much more widespread, and they're no longer doing it in a kind of like, isolated sandbox way, but it actually is becoming one of the most prevalent ways companies guarantee privacy of their data analysis. And so this is kind of like a new question in terms of doing it at scale, boldly, in a lot of new domains. And so this question of kind of like, how do you explain the these tools is quite a prescient one, because kind of like before, it was used, but not necessarily in a kind of like widespread enough way to really make a difference. And I'm gonna.
I have a quick question, just
Sure.
clarification.
Yeah.
So this is just based on the data they're collecting from their users, as you mentioned. So they can't get the data. They can't analyze individual data, right?
Right.
My question is, before this, how was it done, and was the actual privacy of the user encroached on? And is this kind of like the next step where we can just avoid that altogether?
Yeah, totally. And I think maybe the best example is Census Bureau. So we as people residing in the US are like constitutionally mandated to like share our data with this branch of the government every 10 years. And they are like constitutionally mandated to like protect privacy of the users. But of course, the Constitution does not specify what privacy technologies should be used or how, but it just said privacy of the individuals should be maintained. And so, like, historically, they did this by basically taking the database of kind of like, everyone's data in the US, and they would like swap some rows and columns. And so it's like, if you live in like New York, they might swap you with a person who lives in like, New Hampshire, and they might like, swap your age with a person who lives in like, Connecticut. And they kind of like do all these like swaps, so that if you look at the database of like, people and their data, I can't go in and find you and find out all of your personal data. And so that's how this was done until 2020. And the 2020 census is going to be fully like a differentially private, which is fantastic. And to kind of like justify why these tools are needed, the Census Bureau researchers actually performed an attack on their own previous census records, and they showed they could reconstruct something like 80% of the Americans. And so they said like, this is not privacy preserving, and we certainly need new privacy tools. Yeah. Okay, let me actually pause briefly and change headphones. Can you guys hear me now? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, let me resume share. Fantastic. Okay, so
So that's kind of like all the background on like a differential privacy that I'll give in a kind of like technical sense. But of course, the kind of like rest of the talk is going to be how do we explain this? And I'll say it first. I will certainly not go for the entire time, and there'll be time at the end to kind of like talk about these things. Good. So basically, like, here's how companies currently do this in practice, and this is the way on like, large public billboards, Apple describes differential privacy, and you'll see this is very different from the previous two slides, but it's like, a lot more kind of understandable. And the question is like, is it precise, and do users understand this? Are there better ways of like explaining things? And so we are doing a more like, precise approach to how to make better privacy billboards effectively. And so we have two main research questions that I will talk about today. Are basically trying to understand how does the way differential privacy is described impact users' expectations of protections against various information disclosures, and then also how does it impact willingness to share data. And I'll say in the paper, we kind of also talked about what type of information disclosures do users care about, and also how does the probability of these information disclosures occurring affect willingness to share data. But I'm going to talk today so I can be brief about just these first two. So basically, here's a kind of like outline both of the work and of the talk today. Is we first went out and we collected a bunch of different descriptions of a DP in practice. How were they used in various press releases and billboards and academic papers and so on. And then we performed a series of vignette-based surveys to kind of elicit people's responses to these various DP descriptions. And we then asked them, how do you feel about your privacy expectations? Would you share data? And so on. And so let's return to this question. How would a quote unquote good company convince people what is a differential privacy and it's good? And so here's some examples in practice. Organizations talk about how it's a gold standard. They may talk about how is it achieved algorithmically, scrambling individual data, blurring information. They may talk about kind of what does it allow from a kind of machine learning context. And so it won't change the core findings, or it may allow statistical analyses, or they may talk about how this kind of mitigates risk. And so here's some examples. And we went out and we collected a bunch of examples from kind of industry, users, media, and also from kind of academia. I know exactly what is a logo for kind of academics, maybe a cap thing, graduation cap. And so we collected all of these, and we found certain themes emerge. And so we found 6 themes. And for kind of each of these, we created a single consistent representative definition that would kind of capture all the parts of the theme and the kind of core essence of that theme. And we found some that had kind of no essence. And so this description said a differential privacy is a gold standard in data privacy and protection, and is widely recognized as the strongest guarantee of privacy available. And so this is very strong, it's very compelling, but it does not tell you what is differential privacy. It just tells you it's good, everyone likes it. And then we saw there were some that kind of focused on the kind of algorithmic techniques for achieving differential privacy. And so for this one, we had a differential privacy injects statistical noise into the collected data in a way that protects privacy without significantly changing conclusions. And we had a third one that kind of like talked about from a data analysis standpoint, what types of things can be possible now with this privacy guarantee. And so this one said like a differential privacy allows analysts to learn useful information from like a large amounts of data without compromising an individual's privacy. We had a fourth category that kind of like relied on like trusted entities, including math and companies. And so for this one, we had like a differential privacy is a novel mathematical technique to like preserve privacy, which is used by companies like Apple and Uber. And then we had a fifth one talking about the fact that it kind of like mitigates risk. And so this one says like a differential privacy protects the user's identity and the specifics of their data, meaning individuals incur almost no risk by joining the data set. And the final one is the one that you see most commonly in kind of like academic papers. And in fact, this is a quote taken from a kind of like very early like a differential privacy paper, and it says that like a differential privacy ensures that the removal or addition of a single database item does not substantially affect the outcome of any analysis. It follows that kind of no risk is incurred by like joining the database, providing a mathematically rigorous means of coping with the fact that like a distributional information may be disclosive. And so this you probably don't want on a billboard, but it is closer to the kind of like a true essence. And so we wanted to see for these six like a thematic DP descriptions, how did these affect users' behavior and their privacy expectations? And so we plug these into some like a vignette-based surveys. In fact, we had two. And the first one is about sharing salary data. And we gave users a kind of like following story. Imagine that you work in the banking industry. You are friends with a group of other people who work in banking companies in your city. One of your friends is a part of a transparency initiative that is trying to publish general statistics about pay in the banking industry. As a part of this initiative, they have asked everyone in the group to share their salaries and job titles using an online web form on the initiative's website. To reduce the intrusion into personal privacy, your friend says they will use a technique called like a differential privacy. And then we inserted one of these like a six like a DP descriptions, and we also included a kind of like a no privacy baseline. And then we had a slight variant of this asking about data in a kind of like medical context. Imagine that during your next doctor's visit, your like primary care doctor informs you they're a part of a nonprofit organization trying to push the boundaries of medical research. And this nonprofit is asking patients around the country to share their medical records, which will be used to help medical research on improving treatment options and patient care. Your doctor, with your permission, can facilitate this like nonprofit group getting the information they need. To reduce the intrusion into personal privacy, your doctor says they will use a like technique that is called differential privacy. And again, we had our 6 privacy descriptions as well as a kind of like no privacy baseline where we didn't have that. And so then we asked them a survey that was very brief and along with some like, demographic information. We basically asked them 2 things. We asked them, first of all, in this context and given this like a privacy description, would you share your data? And then we asked, which of the following information disclosures would you expect to be possible for your data? And we gave them 6 things, and I'll go through these on the next slide. And so these are basically 6 possible like information disclosure possibilities of kind of like how might your data be shared. And the first one is a hack. And so this is like any criminal or like foreign government that will like hack the organization, might kind of like see your data. The next one is like a law enforcement with a court order could like access your data. And the next one is kind of like at the organizational level, and this was actually like different across the 2 different vignettes. And so here in the like salary example, we asked my friend who was a part of this like transparency initiative will like see my data. In the like healthcare example, we asked if your data will be stored by the nonprofit. The next information disclosure is about a like a data analyst working for this org, being able to learn your data. The next one is about graphs or kind of informational charts created using this data, possibly revealing your information. And the final one is about sharing with like third parties, and can these other organizations access your data? And so we asked them for these 6 information, the disclosure possibilities, do you think they are possible given the privacy description that we gave you? And so I'll start with that one, and I'll tell you how to read this table. And so here in the columns, we have our 6 information disclosure possibilities. On the rows, we have our 6 different privacy descriptions. And in each one, we have what's called like an odds ratio. And this measures the kind of like a change in odds of like expecting protections against this information disclosure compared against a no privacy baseline condition. And so for example, for a hack, we see that you are roughly like twice as likely to expect like protections against hacking if I give you this like unsubstantial privacy description compared against a baseline where I give you no further privacy information. And so having like an odds ratio above 1 means that you have like increased privacy expectations given this like a description. And we have below them like confidence intervals, and these are given at the like 95%. And things in bold are the ones that are like significant at the 5% level. And so some kind of observations of this, you can read this either by the rows or the columns. Going by the columns, you can see most of these privacy descriptions make people believe they have protections against like data analysts or against their like information being shared in graphs. And we see that like in some cases people think they have protections against kind of like a third party sharing and against hacking. Not very many descriptions make people think they have protections against like law enforcement with a warrant or against a kind of like an organization itself. As we read it on the rows, we can ask which of these privacy descriptions causes users to like believe they have typically more like privacy protections. And we see pretty like dramatically talking about how differential privacy mitigates risk is a big one. Also talking about the kind of like algorithmic techniques used to make like a differential privacy happen also cause users to like believe they have a lot of like privacy protections. Interestingly, having this very like a technical description that kind of we thought might be like unparsable actually does make users believe they have stronger privacy protections. And we see like a little bit of protections under kind of talking about what does like DP enable and like trusted entities and this kind and finally our top one, they basically gave kind of like no information which said like, it's great, it's a gold standard, it's the best ever, it actually didn't give people very many like, privacy expectations. And like in some sense, this is almost comforting because this is like, it's in my opinion, not a very good description. It's kind of a like, paternalistic one because like we're saying it's good and don't worry. And here it seems users do in fact want to have like, more information, and they would feel more comfortable if it was talked about how do we achieve this? What kind of risks are like relieved as a result of this? I'll pause briefly here. Any questions on this? I do have more things, but I'll just ask if there's any like, questions here. Okay, so next, we want to know not just do they have high expectations, we also want to know do they have like a correct expectations. And so that's our kind of next question. And to kind of like go in to this notion of like correctness, it actually requires more details in terms of like how is this thing implemented. And there's two kind of like a typical like a DP implementation models. One is known as a kind of like central model, and here we're going to have users provide their exact data to some like to some kind of like a trusted curator who will then promise that they will like only publish things in this like privacy preserving way. And so for this, have in mind as an example, Census Bureau, and we all legally have to provide our exact data, and they are going to like publicly promise, I will not publish things except in this like a privacy preserving way. And so in this case, in terms of the possibilities of privacy disclosure, it actually in fact is more vulnerable because there exists a single data set like that like contains everyone's data that could be hacked, leaked, shared. And so really this one requires a lot of trust in the curator to like have in place both good ethics and good like security protocols to kind of like make sure these things don't happen. Both these vulnerabilities do exist. And you might wonder, why do we even have this if it's more vulnerable? And it's because this model gives us like substantially improved accuracy of the data analysis itself. On the other hand, we have what's known as the local model. And like in this case, users are going to add data. They're going to add noise to their data before they ever even share it with some possibly like untrusted data curator. And so the analyst never sees data; they only see a noisy signal about your data. And so in fact, this is what's used by like Apple, and this is kind of like what their billboard means. Your data stays on your iPhone, and it really means we're not going to like transmit your true data. We're going to like transmit a noisy version of your data. And so that's kind of like what the billboard means. And this in fact has a lot lower vulnerabilities because there doesn't exist a single concise data set that like can be hacked or shared or whatever, and so provides like stronger practical privacy in that sense. But on the other hand, you're going to get much worse accuracy because you like don't have data. You have like a bunch of noise that is like biased in the correct like a direction, but you don't actually have like a raw data set. And so if we look at these like ground truth vulnerabilities, both of these models like protect against like graphs, models, statistics, and they differ in kind of all the rest. And the difference really is kind of like does there exist a data set that like can be shared, leaked, hacked, published, etc. And it's like it's important to have this kind of like asterisks as we talk about the ground truth. Is really this is for kind of like typical implementation, and the ground truth may vary across these two models. But I think in the sake of like time, and because we aren't engineers here, I'll just say this is like typically what's true, but it's not necessarily always what's true, but it's what usually is true. And so if we compare people's like perceptions against the ground truth, I have here like on the top comparing against like a ground truth of the local model, and on the bottom like a comparing against a ground truth of the like central model under kind of like each of these different privacy conditions. And we plot on the x-axis what fraction of the time are they correct. So we see that under the central model, they are correct half the time. And recall these are like, binary, like, yes, no questions. And so they would get the same accuracy if they guessed randomly. So that's bad. And the local model, it's in fact even worse. How they're doing strictly worse than random guessing because they're only correct like 25% of the time. And so this is like not good in terms of accuracy. And so this tells us we certainly need more work in the future about this kind of like nuance of these two separate models and how can we more clearly explain the like a ground truth. And so my final point is kind of understanding how do like a differential privacy descriptions affect sharing of data. And we have the same analysis here, and we have this kind of like, odds ratio of like, how much more likely are people to share data compared against no privacy baseline. And we see nothing is really significant. And so we actually see the kind of like a changing the way in which we describe DP doesn't have a significant effect in terms of sharing data. But we actually did see a big like difference across these two scenarios. And so people were kind of like much more likely to share their kind of like salary data than they were to share medical data. And so this tells us if our goal is to like increase sharing data, these 6 things that we have here are like not quite the answer yet. We do see the type of data and the context does have a pretty significant impact. And so these are the kind of like main points here. And I'll give you also the kind of like punchlines of the parts in the paper, not in the talk, because we also saw users do care about these like specific information disclosures and giving like a protection against these information disclosures does in fact increase willingness to share. And so perhaps if you want to use differential privacy to kind of like increase sharing data, then we should figure out how do we make people have beliefs of like a stronger privacy protections against the types of like information disclosures that they care about, and that will then in turn cause them to share like data more. And of course we have to do more work in the future in terms of like describing details of kind of like how these things are like implemented, because in terms of giving people accurate beliefs, it matters if we're in the like local versus central model. And we also have to figure out how do we explain this like epsilon value to them. Those are like a privacy parameter and can pretty dramatically affect the kind of like a real world privacy guarantees they receive. That's all, and I'm very happy to like spark this conversation. I think this is like an excellent place for this work, specifically because I don't have an answer. And there's certainly a lot of work for like policy work and research on both sides of trying to figure out how can we have meaningful, impactful policy made about these privacy tools that we like don't even know how to like describe to lay users yet. And so I would love to hear your thoughts, comments, and questions.
So Rachel, thank you so much. That was absolutely great. Let me go first, since I'm the most ignorant person probably on the call, and ask you 2 ridiculous questions, which hopefully you can somehow sort through what I'm really asking and give me an answer. So question number
Sure.
1 is, what if you never shared data, but only responded to questions? In other words, I won't share your data at all, but sources can ask questions, which I'll answer based on the database, but I'll never share your data with anyone ever. That's question number 1.
Mhm.
Do you want both of the questions?
Yeah.
Question number 2
Yeah.
is, what if you could create a separate database for every data point, so that even if someone hacked, for example, on the census, they'd have to hack 200 million separate databases, which would make it very difficult. And in terms of the pool of data, like the census, before you put my file in there, you would change its name. So you'd have my income tax file in a separate database for only me. And then in terms of the pool data from which you would answer questions, I would become XIYQ. So those are my 2 questions.
Yeah. Okay, good. So for your first question, which is what if I never share data, but I only answer questions about it? That's kind of captured by our graphs question.
Right.
And so this is asking if I publish aggregate statistics,
Right.
graphs, models, charts. And actually, this is how the kind of algorithmic differential privacy is typically modeled. Is we model it to some kind of analyst interacting with the data, and the analyst is going to submit queries and get back answers. And so that's basically what this graphs question is. And so that is the one thing that is kind of unilaterally protected against is having leaks from that approach. And so that's actually where a differential privacy excels the most, but that's not necessarily what people care about the most. They care about hacks and sharing data, and they tend to actually not care quite as much about if you publish the mean of some attribute in the database, is it going to leak information? People tend to actually not really care about that as much, which I think is a bit surprising, but yeah. And to your second point, what if we stored each thing as kind of one person's database of size 1? So that's kind of what local privacy does. Not quite, but it's close. How we're basically treating each person as if they are in a database by themselves, and then kind of adding noise. I think what you're saying is something slightly different, which is saying I'm still going to give you my raw data and you can kind of analyze it. We're going to store it separately and possibly encrypt it separately. That sounds great in terms of security. Probably not great in terms of storage costs for the companies
really
and the
expensive.
government.
Yeah.
But I do think that you raise an interesting point I should make, which is that a differential privacy does not exist as a kind of sole privacy protection to be used, but rather it has to be used in conjunction with things like cryptography to kind of communicate and store the data, and making sure those things are going to be stored securely. Because if you only publish things in a privacy preserving manner, then you get hacked very easily. Well, that's still not private, because now all of a sudden everyone has
Right.
everything. And so you're right that it's important to kind of combine these differentially private tools with good security practices as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We have 4 minutes, so we got time for 1 or 2 questions.
I think we have a hand up. Huna?
Yeah, thank you so much for interesting presentation. Yeah, I I have two quick questions. One is I saw that the sampling was quite like diverse. Like there is also like, have you found any like interesting fact depending on the race or income level, like any like interesting contrast? And then second question is, I have like some concern about my privacy in terms of using Google Home or like Amazon Alexa. And then, you know, unlike the other platforms where I know that like what kind of information I'm sharing, but for AI, this type of device, like home device, we are not sure how much information we are sharing and then how much privacy I'm like in danger in a way. So like, what's your stance on the current privacy protection in terms of this like home device area? Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Fantastic questions. So very briefly, we didn't actually see very many impacts in terms of like demographics that were significant. We did see a few that we kind of noted made sense in our current social environment. For example, we saw race was like significantly correlated with wanting protection against like law enforcement. And I think again, like, in our world, that is unsurprising. And so we observed things like that, but there weren't very many of those. We also didn't see correlation with kind of like internet skill scores. We thought that maybe like more tech savvy users may have different privacy preferences or concerns, and that turned out to not particularly be the case. And so that was like an interesting observation too. To your point about like, home security, I think these are kind of like precisely the questions that inspired this work, is kind of like on the like, theoretical computer science privacy community. A lot of the researchers tend to think privacy is solved. We have differential privacy, we have algorithms, like it's fine. And then you go into practice and it's like, what is my Alexa storing about me? And it does not feel like a solved problem in the slightest. And so I don't have real answers in terms of like, how private are these things? How secure are they? How can we have better privacy protections? But I just do feel strongly as a research community, both on the kind of like, policy side as well as on the like tech side, we have to like strive more to kind of like, speak each other's languages better, because I think one reason there's like a tremendous gap between like theory and practice is because people are content to like, speak their own languages and publish their own papers in their own fields and consider it solved, and we're left with these like huge gaps. And I hope this is only the like a beginning of a long and fruitful conversation.
Well, that seems like a very profound and perfect way to close. Rachel, you did a tremendous job, I think, at least, again, probably the most ignorant person on the call, of talking about an extremely complex subject in a way that even someone as dumb as I can understand it. So thank you so much. Let me flip it back over to Jeremy to close it out.
Bill's too modest. He's got some background in stats, if I remember correctly. But anyway, thank you so much. It was a great presentation. I think this is something that we haven't seen before in our Food for Thought. And I left with more questions than I came in with. So I think that's a great presentation and we'd love to have you back. And just for everyone, thank you for joining us. We have Food for Thought almost every week. So please check our Food for Thought guest lecture page for the next sessions. And Rachel, thanks again for joining us.
And we'll have up the recording next week.
Yes.
Great.
All righty.
Fantastic. And thank you again. It was my absolute pleasure being here.
You were great, Rachel. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. See you next week.
Take
See you
care.
next